Good morning and welcome to the studio here at African Utility Week. I'm Claire Volkwyn, editor of Metering and Smart Energy International. And with me this morning I have Chris Trimble, who is a senior energy specialist with the World Bank. Chris, thanks so much for joining us this morning. I was wondering if you could possibly elaborate on some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier. I know that you presented on financial viabilities for utilities, and this is obviously quite a challenge for many utilities across many regions. Why is that, and what needs to change in order for utilities to become more financially viable?
Thanks, Claire, for the question. Yeah. So, I mean, a big theme we've heard about this week in the conference is the need to move from the idea of billions of investment to trillions. You know, the needs are very substantial across the continent, especially with the goals, ambitious goals to meet universal access to electricity. But in the current state of things, the financial viability of utilities is just not there. So it's very, very difficult to attract private sector investment because there's such a huge risk that's associated with the off-taker of the utilities. But unfortunately, private sector capital is very much needed because public financing, like the World Bank and other multilaterals and bilaterals, is limited. You know, the amount of concessional financing available is only going to fill probably 5 or 10% of the need. So you need, 90-95% of the financing to come from private sector. Okay. But with the current state, that's either not going to be possible with the financial viability not there of utilities, or it's going to be very expensive investments. So it's a big issue. It's something that that I think so far has not been getting enough attention in the overall agenda of moving towards universal access.
There's a lot of talk. I mean, as you mentioned, it's something that's come up a number of times here about financial viability and bankability. Can you talk to us about the concept of bankability? Why it is something that people are finding a challenge to provide or put forward bankable projects, and what does an ideally viable and bankable project look like?
Yeah. So we zoom out a little bit. First of all, looking at the financial viability of utilities, and then go to the project level. We've something we've been looking at. We just launched this study looking at the viability of utilities across Africa. So first, it's the largest study we know of its kind, and it's looked across 39 countries in Africa. So trying to understand what's the current state of viability, and the results are sobering. We found that of the 39 countries that we looked at in the study, only 2 actually fully covering all their costs, which is quite a sad state of affairs. Yeah. And then of the rest, around 19 are covering their operating expenditures. So we looked at the difference between the operating expenditures, the day-to-day cash that's needed for the utility to exist and function, and then there's also the kind of capital investments, the capex that's needed to make the investments. So around the half are covering the operating expenditures, but only 2 are covering both the opex and the capex. And then we looked at, what's causing that? Why do we see these large gaps, these large revenue gaps between the cost and the revenue? And you see a picture across the continent where there's a large portion of losses on the network. So you've got around 25% on average of transmission distribution losses. That means for every 100 kilowatt hours that's sent out from the generation plant, only 75 actually reaches the end consumer. So you get a lot of losses in the network. It's normal to have some losses. Every system in the world has losses, but you can get those down to 8 or 10%. With some fairly standard measures in investments on the grid. So in theory, it should be straightforward to help reduce those inefficiencies in the system with utilities. And then you'd look at then collections. So we find that on average, only 90% of bills are actually collected from customers. So that's another big issue that you can help to close some of that gap. We also looked at overstaffing. That's some utilities you see overstaffing, and that's an opportunity to reduce costs. And then of course there's the pricing issue as well. So we looked at all those in total, and very often when we talk about financial viability, one of the first solutions that people look towards is pricing, but that's also politically sensitive. So yes. What we found here is that there are actually many things that can be done behind the scenes to help bring down the cost structure and move towards financial viability. So actually what we found is that if you consider what it would be a benchmark performance given global experiences, around a third of the utilities in Africa could reach financial viability without any price increases. And then in the remainder, there probably would be some degree of price increases needed. That being said, there are also opportunities for bringing down the cost over time through improving the energy mix. So, there are a lot of abundant resources on the continent, hydro being a good example, where you have very low cost, clean energy. But today, especially in West Africa, you have a lot of countries that are very dependent on imported oil and diesel for generating electricity, which is very expensive and risky because it exposes them to international price shocks outside of their control.
Yes.
So there are lots of opportunities in the long run to improve the energy mix of countries and help to bring down those overall cost structures. So those are some of the issues we've been looking at in the study, and I think there are lots of good examples across the continent where utilities have made substantial progress. One utility we looked at, one of the two that I mentioned is in Uganda, where they've managed to bring down the losses quite substantially over a relatively short period of time. So brought down losses from around 40-45% to around 15-20%, and that's a big improvement on their viability.
Huge, yeah.
So,
and if I may interrupt for a second, are these predominantly technical losses, or are they non-technical losses, or a significant combination of both?
Well, that's a good question, and unfortunately, it's very difficult to tell because a lot of in fact, most countries in Africa don't have the technology in place to actually determine what is the breakdown between commercial and technical losses. So again, the assumption is there is a lot of theft in many cases on the commercial losses, but we don't have the ability right now to actually have that breakdown. But it is possible, and now we have with so many of the smart metering technology available. It's possible to put into the system meters at every all those primary and secondary substations, and also then at the feeder pools. So you can then very quickly actually get a sense of where are the losses happening in the network and where might neighborhoods be where there's theft happening. But today it's a bit of a black hole. Basically, utilities know how much they send out to the grid and how much they sell to the customer. What happens in the middle is a bit of a black hole. So one option that some utilities have started to do, and others could do as well, is put in place revenue protection programs, which basically looks across the chain from the point that the kilowatt hour is sent out to the point that the bill is collected from the end consumer, and trying to understand across that, how do I identify where the losses are happening, and then how do I put in place systems, both the technology on the grid, but also then the IT systems and software at the utility, to understand how to manage that and protect that revenue. A very simple way to reach viability is to increase prices, for the revenues for the utility, but there's obviously a constraint there that you can't, or there's only so much that households can afford.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of part that we looked at in the study, is the affordability for households. And some interesting results, because the finding we have is that actually the issue is not so much on tariffs themselves, at least for subsistence level of consumption. In most cases we found that tariffs are affordable for households. The issue is more on connection costs. So very often you see connection costs for households can be in the hundreds of dollars, which for a rural, low-income family, that's a almost insurmountable amount of capital to put up front. So that's a big block. That's an obstacle in the move towards universal access. That the connection cost is one critical area to try and look at, to understand how to make it more affordable for households. One option is through things like payment plans. You see some countries where you have a payment plan in place, but even there where we see them, there's still issues of affordability in terms of the month-to-month cost. Another option is to have rural electrification funds, where the cost is actually the cost of the connection is financed either through the government or through some kind of concessional financing. Another option is where you can actually share the connection cost across the all customer base. So there's like a fixed charge that we put into everyone's electricity bill to help cover the cost of connecting new customers. So there are ways that you can get around, you can overcome the obstacle that's there from a connection cost perspective.
Yeah, because in the report, I think Lucio mentioned that there are some places where the connection cost is like $300-400 per household.
That's right.
Which considering the average income is really prohibitive.
That's correct. Yeah, no, it's almost impossible for a household to do that. And by the way, those costs that you're looking at are also the lowest possible. That's assuming that the household, for example, lives close to the nearest pool, or they live beside a school or something like that. Very often, households can't even access that lowest cost. It could be even higher, if they live really far from the grid. So it's a big issue that needs to be have more focus, because I said on the tariff side, the actual once the customer is connected, it is in most cases quite affordable for them to consume the electricity.
So unfortunately we don't have a lot more time, but I did want to ask, I know that you mentioned Umeme, for instance, as a good example of a utility that has become is a benchmark against which people could be looking and comparing themselves. What was the other utility that was, to your mind and according to the study, financially viable?
Yeah, it was the Seychelles, which is maybe not a typical country in sub-Saharan Africa. But what we've seen in both those examples, and in other cases, in other countries where they're close to viability, is you've had a strong commitment from the leadership, both in the government and also in the utility, to move towards viability. So that means that there's a commitment to improving the efficiency of the utilities operations. Actual real investments in bringing down the T&D losses, inputting meters correctly in the systems to make sure that that all customers have a meter, so that that there's not unmetered consumption that's happening. Another issue we saw is many customers, because of the cost of connection, you have shared meters. So you've got cases where 2 or 3 or 4 families sharing a meter. So it's important for the utility to have a strong emphasis to make sure that every customer is metered and that there's only one customer per meter. So that kind of commitment to those types of programs, commitment to revenue protection programs, to make sure that you have the systems and the commercial software that's there to actually track billing and collections. And then a political commitment to, if there's still need to increase tariffs, once you've reached efficient operations, commitment at a political level to actually do that. But that's a message that we have, is that pricing is not probably the best place to start, given the political sensitivity around pricing. Much better to focus on trying to bring down some of the costs, on the other side of the coin.
And that's just really through increasing efficiencies and improving collections.
And yeah, exactly. Bringing down T&D losses, improving your bill collection rate, improving your staffing, if you're optimizing your level of staffing if that's necessary, trying to improve your energy mix over time to bring down the costs of energy generation, and then if it's still a requirement, then maybe looking at tariff increases as well.
Yeah, but then I guess the tariff increase is not going to be as substantial as it would have been before all of those interventions.
Exactly. Yeah.
Chris, sadly, this is literally all we have time for today, but thank you so much for making the time to chat with us. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I loved the presentation. I do have to ask, and I realize I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit, is this report available in a soft copy version?
Yep.
And could we perhaps put it on our site or provide a link so that people can download it?
We would love that. Yeah, no, it's we have all this is the final report, but there's also 4 or 5 background papers that feed into it in much more detail, and then all the data that we collected through the report is actually available on our website too, in Excel database. So it's quite a rich database that's there, and as I said, I think the first of its kind that has existed across the continent. So it's very useful for utilities to be able to see how they compare in terms of T&D losses or bill collection rates. They can see where they stand compared to some of their peers. So that's a very useful benchmarking tool for utilities and then regulators as well. That's one of the main, I think, value adds of the study.
Fantastic. So, ladies and gentlemen, you heard it here. We'll be providing a link underneath this video so that you can access the report via the World Bank website. Give it a read. It's really very interesting. I think it's interesting to see where the highest price points are, where the highest operating costs lie. And I certainly found it very interesting when I looked through the report and listened to the presentation from the World Bank. So from African Utility Week, I'm Claire Volkwyn. Thanks for watching.